Hello.
Okay, so today my guest is Professor Farok Contractor. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Farok as a person, Professor Contractor, as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I will skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Farok is the fellow of AIB, has held other term fellowships such as Fulbright and Unilever fellowships, has served on the executive board of AOM, International Management Division, executive board of the AIB, has written over 100 scholarly articles, 10 edited or co-authored books, organized several international conferences on cooperative strategies in IB, has organized many panels, symposiums, professional development lectures, also has served as the editor, co-editor, or editorial board member of 12 journals and was a guest or consulting editor in at least 10. He received the AIB's silver medal for publishing among the highest number of scholarly papers in JIBS, and he appears in national, international news and media outlets and comments on many diverse topics such as trade, China, FDI, intellectual property issues, and tariff issues. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
First question about your background. What did you want to become when you were a child? Where were you born? How did you choose the field? What can you tell us?
Well, I grew up in Bombay, which is now renamed Mumbai, in the Parsi Zoroastrian community. India is one of the most diverse countries on the planet, and Parsis, my community, are refugees from Persia who migrated to India in the 9th century. And Zoroastrianism, incidentally, is arguably the oldest monotheist religion. All of this is to tell you where my surname comes from, Contractor. You know that until the 20th century, from Iceland to the Middle East, many people didn't have a surname. My great-great-grandfather was a contractor who would go into the then nearby jungles and cut down trees for India's first railway ties, the ties that go underneath the rails. India was and is a poor country. I grew up in an upper middle class family. But it was a poor socialist country and we didn't have a telephone or TV until the 1980s. I did my homework on the dining table. 10 of us lived in a large sprawling apartment, including 4 live-in domestic helpers. I went to the University of Bombay where I got my mechanical engineering degree at age 20 and went to study in the United States at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, for a MS in industrial engineering. And I say this also because engineering is a good preparation for a business or an academic career because it gives you a way of thinking, an analytical view of the world. So how did I get into academia? After my master's degree, I'd hoped to stay on in the US and work as an engineer. But the American government wanted to send me to fight in Vietnam, even though I only had a student visa. Eventually, I returned to Bombay and joined the Tata Group, which is one of the India's biggest conglomerates, as an executive for exports. That was my first exposure to international business. And eventually we decided to export fashion leather garments. And India's comparative advantage is that despite only 6% of the world's land surface, it had 27% of the world's cattle and livestock resources, suitable, of course, for leather garments. But despite being the largest business conglomerate, Tata's had no expertise in leather finishing technology and no international marketing skills in this sector. The CEO I reported to was one of these very clever Indians. He induced a French tannery company and promised to become a joint venture partner. And on that basis, he requested them to send over experienced engineers. And when a French engineer would come over, we'd put them up in the very best hotel, treat them royally, take them around India. So they loved the visits. And at the end of each visit, we would debrief them for the technology, the equipment list, etc. Then they sent over more engineers because it was a wonderful, I guess, junket for them in part. And finally, we got from the French through this process, the entire equipment list and the assembly line setup. So this began my interest in strategic alliance field, in which I have more than 50 or maybe 75 papers. But this experience also raised for me an academic question that is even more salient today than ever before, what I call the disclosure dilemma, meaning when you have a negotiation to form an alliance or a partnership, if you're the technology owner, how much do you want to disclose in the negotiation stage and how much do you want to withhold? If you withhold information too much, the other party may never get interested. If you disclose too much, then your clever partner, like the Indian company I work for, can learn so much during the negotiation process that they can go it alone and not form the alliance at all. My Jibs article in 2019, which is entitled, Can a Firm Find the Balance Between Openness and Secrecy Towards the Theory of an Optimum Level of Disclosure, describes things like the disclosure dilemma, different types of intellectual assets, and also unintended spillovers of knowledge. And we have today a big research field, open source versus secrecy. Again, even though the Tata group I was working for at that time was the biggest conglomerate, it had no leather finishing technology. So we also invited a German company to give us a turnkey proposal to install the equipment, the assembly line, build the factory, give us some training and hand over the keys. They gave us a price of, let's say, X million dollars. But from the debriefing of the French engineers, we could see that the equipment list in the factory, the tangible equipment, would only add up to Y million dollars, and X was 2 or 3 times Y. So the German proposal was unpalatably high compared to the cost of the factory and equipment alone. But just getting the machines does not necessarily give a company the right quality and output. So the dilemma, another dilemma, is that the sum of tangible assets, meaning the sum of the production equipment, does not add up to a capability, which includes intangible assets. So then the question is, how does one put a money value or dollar value on a technology package in which one alliance partner is sharing or transferring their technology to another? And how does one value a knowledge bundle comprising both tangible and intangible assets, especially when the technology supplier is understandably reluctant to disclose full information during the negotiation stage? And this was a question I pursued in my doctoral dissertation at the Wharton School, which was entitled something like Pricing of Technology in International Licensing Agreements, which I completed in 1980. And this subject remains a fertile field today for research.
Oh, Farok, can I ask you a question about your upbringing? Because it is clear that your time in Tata or the experience with the Tata group has shaped a lot of your research questions in the later years. Mm-hmm. What was the best advice you received during this time when you were going through the Tata group?
Well, I actually left the Tata group after a few years because, as I said, the managing director I was working for was pushing the boundaries of ethics, and also because these questions were very interesting to me. So I thought I might go for my M.B.A. and Ph.D. at Wharton. And another thing maybe I'll tell you now, I did the corporate financial planning even though I was only an engineer and did not have any finance training. I bought a textbook on corporate finance and put together the projected cash flows and net present value and so on. And the interesting thing is that I made a mistake, which rebounded on me. The mistake was that at the end of every cell in the spreadsheet, I put the decimal places, meaning the small money in rupees. And when it went to the board, by the way, the numbers were correct, but they said, why is this person putting the decimal places and the small money? And that gave me an idea that, well, I'd better go and get my M.B.A. and Ph.D. So that's why I switched to Wharton.
About your training, how do you find the balance between creativity and intellectual curiosity, and what's the sweet spot between new ideas, creative ideas that are groundbreaking versus the ones that are incremental? How do you find the sweet spot?
Well, we had a sound problem. I don't know if that's going to be recorded or you'll have to re-record what your question, but I think I got the gist of it. I was going to say later on, and I'll say it now, that sometimes just looking at data and not being shy of inductive research can lead to the formation of creative hypotheses. And my experience actually led me into this question of negotiating and forming collaborations, which at that time were primarily in emerging countries, where the government required a local company to have required a foreign partner to have a local collaborator. Today, of course, that world has disappeared, but the amazing thing is that alliances today are in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in all over the world when there's no government mandate. So that's how I got into the strategic alliance field.
In your opinion, what are the areas, what are the questions, what are the variables that are understudied in IB?
Well, some of these ideas I've been pursuing for the last 40 years are still very relevant. For example, negotiating, forming, and governing collaborations. And what has changed in the last 40 years is that the dividing line between joint ventures or equity alliances and non-equity or contractual alliances has blurred. And in fact, one research question is, why has there been a shift where probably 90% of alliances are contractual rather than equity joint ventures? What has changed in the landscape? We used to have most collaborations internationally through JVs. Now we have contractual alliances. Is that because lawyers are getting better practiced at forming contracts? Is it because there are more and more real options clauses? In fact, one area that one should look at is the real options clauses in strategic alliance agreements. And then the issue of how do you calculate a money value on intellectual property transferred between one partner and another is still unexplored. And then I have another proposal, which I actually sort of touched upon in a paper in International Business Review in 2000, is, okay, one partner is a technology supplier. The other partner receives the knowledge and the technology and the capability and has to pay or compensate the technology supplier. The unexplored question for research is, through what mix of equity share, if there's a joint venture, let's call that alpha, through royalties R, let's call them small r. Very often these alliances nowadays have a supply chain component. Let's call that the markup M. And then there's a lump sum or upfront payment, L, at the time of signing the agreement. And the interesting thing is that the trade-offs to come up with a certain total net present value between alpha, R, M, and L, these trade-offs are not linear. They're non-linear and non-zero sum. So this remains to be explored. And then another research question is, when you negotiate a transfer of proprietary technology, how much do you want to intentionally disclose and how much not to share with a partner? And by the way, this is part of the GIBS 2019 paper, whose title I think I mentioned. And that 2019 paper also talks about 3 categories of intellectual assets. One is registered intellectual property, like patents and brands. The other is unregistered trade secrets. And the third is collective tacit know-how. And the interesting thing that I found was that for legal and strategic reasons, number 2, or trade secrets, have begun to supplant in alliance agreements the importance of patents and brands. So then the question is, why has that shift taken place? I have some hypotheses. For example, the very act of filing a patent discloses something to the world, to potential competitors. Also, patents are becoming less and less defensible than the past. So the change of emphasis between these 3 types of intellectual assets is another research question. Then I have other research areas which I can get into if you think it's appropriate, Ilgaz.
Sure, of course.
I did a sabbatical with the UN, what used to be called the Center on Transnational Corporations. And that raised some interesting questions. Research question: how do firms choose between countries to invest in? There are 192 nations on the planet, according to the UN. How does a multinational actually decide which country to enter by FDI? And then from the local government point of view, what attracts or repels FDI to a country? And of course, the determinants of FDI have been traditionally explained statistically using microeconomic factors such as market size and GDP. But I've been focusing in 2 recent papers on regulatory and institutional factors. And to illustrate what I said earlier, just looking at World Bank data on the ease of doing business, there's a whole database where in a 2020 paper published in International Business Review, I took the regulatory factors, I and co-authors took regulatory factors from 189 countries, pretty much all of them, and tried to see to what extent does the FDI GDP ratio, meaning how much FDI does a country receive, is explained not so much by macroeconomic factors, but by the institutional and regulatory factors. And in a paper forthcoming in Journal of International Management later this year, I look at only the emerging countries, and there's a somewhat different set of factors that either attract or repel FDI. Shall I continue?
Of course.
Yeah. Then another research area that I've been drawn into since 2003 is the performance versus degree of internationalization relationship. And what I proposed in my GIBS 2030, I and co-authors proposed in the GIBS 2003 paper, was the paradigm called the 3-stage or S-curve or sigmoid paradigm. And to what extent does context matter in the empirical results, culture as an explanatory variable? I think I'd better tell you just 2 more and then listen to your next question. I've been interested in emerging markets also as destinations for foreign direct investment, excuse me, and also the strategies of emerging market multinationals in their international expansion. And finally, very recently in a paper that's going to come out in GIBS shortly, global value chain reconfiguration or resilience. We all know that the pandemic has thrown global supply chains into some kind of uncertainty or higher risk perception. And, you know, I actually talked to my supply chain colleagues in Rutgers Business School. And astonishingly, I couldn't find a single paper which links the cost per unit of a procured component or item against the number of suppliers. And so I propose in my JIBS 2021 paper, a J-curve hypothesis. And so the cost per unit of procured item is a function of the number of suppliers internationally, geographical diversification of the suppliers, the propinquity of sources, and the inventory levels at various points in the supply chain. And the title of the paper, of course, is on globalization, which here's the title: The World Economy Will Need Even More Globalization in the Post-Pandemic 2021 Decade. Getting back to GVCs, another research area which really has not been explored properly: to what extent can GVC risk in international supply chains be reduced by 4 digital technologies still in their infancy? Blockchain, number 2, integration of vendor and buyer computer systems, number 3, artificial intelligence, which produces predictive analytics, and number 4, 5G monitoring of surface transport. So these are some of my research areas. Ilgaz, I'd welcome any of your questions.
I have a couple of questions, actually. First, in your paper, yeah, you do talk about more globalization is needed, and I want to come back to this evolution in IB. The field is moving, the real life between governments, between companies is also evolving. From 1980s, 1990s, the huge windfall globalization research is actually shifting a bit to deglobalization. And the governments are being more powerful and more influential. How does it impact our research in IB, given the fact that the deglobalization forces are gaining strength and frequency?
Yes, there's been increased nationalism, there's been increased protectionism, there's talk about decoupling, especially between China and India. But my JIBS paper is arguing that these are only transient, temporary slowdowns. FDI has declined from its peak in 2016 or 2017, true. But in terms of cross-border trade and another totally neglected area in international business, the cross-border licensing of intellectual property, that continues. And so if you look at the table, which I sent you, we have in the year 1980 cross-border licensing fees amounting to only $10 billion. By 2019, that had grown to 391 billion. Even FDI was only 53 billion for the world as a whole, FDI, cross-border FDI capital flows. By 2019, although they declined below the peak of 2016 or 2017, it was still, compared to 53 billion, 2,100 billion. And in terms of trade, if you take the sum total of all countries' exports, in 1980, it was only 27 billion. By 2019, it had increased to 29,932 billion. So yes, there's been a bit of a slowdown, a lot of talk of protection, Trump tariffs, and so on. But in my view, that's only a temporary hiccup, that the justifications for globalization are an inexorable force that will continue into the future.
It's interesting. What you're saying is very important, very interesting, but I'm curious. The economic system based on, especially right after the COVID, is based on some sort of value attached to money, right? And the new economic theory, the new thrust in economic theory is that powerful governments should be able to print money to compensate for the loss in demand, loss in supply, especially during big crisis like we're having. And yet, not many companies and not many countries can actually print valuable money. European Union euro is printable very few times. It has to go through 1,000 hoops. The US Treasury is printing it. It's ridiculously huge amounts of money is floating. The stock market is skyrocketing. And yet we're in the middle of a huge crisis, right? I think there's a huge shift in the dynamics of what economic theory, old classical, neoclassical economic theories are predicting. What you're saying about globalization, that the need is going to be more for globalization is interesting. And yet, it will not impact every nation equally, right? The way that it impacts the world that you are describing, it impacts America differently than, say, Iran or India or even China. So I think we're going to be seeing a couple of different games played on the same playing field with different theories, different dynamics happening. Given your expertise, given your experience, what do you see as the next big question in IB, the biggest challenge in IB? And what is the advice to young scholars who need to come up with great dissertation topics? What are the pitfalls to avoid? What are the new frontiers to pursue?
Well, yeah, so you have two questions about the changing socio-economic and political environment around the world and what used to be the primacy of the United States, which is now not declining necessarily in absolute terms, but is certainly declining in relative terms as big countries like China and India come on the scene. And then your second part of the question was, what is the advice for aspiring scholars? Well, these are very big questions, but the relative position of the US will definitely decline, which is another reason why collaboration in research, and I don't mean, business school research, I mean all research, whether it's for medicine or whether it's in physics. So we're going to see a world where there's greater intergovernmental cooperation, whether it's be in space or whether it be for global warming or whether it be for pandemics, etc. And the Gibbs article that's going to come out in a month or two, I hope, is saying that the multinational company plays an indispensable bridging role as a bridge or an arbitrageur between what is still very unequal world. If the world was absolutely flat, which of course it's not, then you wouldn't need necessarily multinational companies to arbitrage differences. And I am actually unabashedly taking ideas from Pankaj Ghemawat, his 2007 work on managing differences. So that imperative of the multinational company, its raison d'etre, will not go away. It will become even more relevant. As far as advice for aspiring scholars, I would say, look for research topics where not much is known or where there's controversy in the field. Look at new databases, just look at the data, more of which are becoming available every day. See what researchable questions intuitively occur to you. And as I say, currently, orthodoxy may not like it, but do not dismiss inductive research as illegitimate, especially in relatively unexplored domains. And as I said earlier, just by looking casually at World Bank data on their ease of doing business rankings, which have 30 sub-indicators, regulatory and institutional FDI determinants, that gave me the idea to see if, as an explanatory variable, we could use some of these institutional and regulatory factors for each country to explain how much each country is getting in terms of FDI. Another advice I would give is get an M.B.A. on the side while doing your Ph.D. Take courses in finance and some in marketing. And I'll tell you why. I'm astonished, especially when I talk to my OB colleagues, the organization behavior colleagues. Many of them have no idea about finance or marketing. And some of them may not even know exactly what net present value is. And the point I'm trying to make is money talks. So if you are a good researcher, especially in a wide-ranging field like international business, needs to have that corporate background. Why an MBA on the side? I mean, if you're doing your PhD at Harvard, that general corporate capability comes to you naturally. But if you're doing your PhD at a school that is much more sort of empirical research driven, you can get a PhD without knowing simple things like net present value or international marketing. So the broader you are as a background on the side, the better your research questions would be. Minimize administrative duties before tenure, that's sort of conventional wisdom. Take on tasks and positions in AIB, AOM, SMS, etc., which are useful not just for your CV, but also to build networks. I'll give you examples. Many of my research interests have come about over a lunch or a cup of coffee. For example, the three-stage internationalization performance paradigm came about in a coffee break after the Washington, D.C. AIB conference, where I gave a paper, which was a conceptual paper. And then there was another set of authors that had some data and empirics. And we decided, hey, why not try my paradigm on their data? And that created interest in the field. It used to be a moribund subfield, and now there are a lot of papers coming out on this question. Or even the regulatory and institutional determinants of FDI flows. That was over a lunch meeting during the 2016 AOM meeting. And partner with other scholars to propose special issues of journals. That can focus your attention on that special research topic and also get you known widely and invite senior scholars to become co-editors of these special issues. So where next do I go? Well, there's a lot of wonderful stuff left to explore, unexplored research areas. And also, by the way, I have a wide-ranging global business blog called globalbusiness.blog. You just put that into Google, and it'll take you to articles ranging from China to India to undervaluation of currencies, overvaluation of currencies, etc. Because my interests go beyond research to questions such as, have American presidents been right or wrong in accusing China of undervaluing the RMB or the yuan? So this globalbusiness.blog has been read. I don't mean they're regular followers, but they've been read by viewers from 172 countries.
Thank you. This was very informative. I learned a lot. There are so many different research topics that you discussed, many different dissertation ideas you introduced. Thank you so much for your time and for your feedback.
Thank you, Ilgaz, very much for doing this for the AIB. And I hope that more research ideas will come out of all these interviews that you have done. Thank you so much.